Okay. Oh, well, we have 30 people on. No, we're expecting a little bit more, but I figure we can just jump into it and folks will join in and they'll get the idea. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, which is called Advancing Public Policies to Support Local News. I'm Caitlin Johnson. I'm the Communications Director of Policy Matters Ohio, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Zach Schiller. He's the Research Director of Policy Matters Ohio. The purpose of this webinar is to summarize the findings of a recent Policy Matters report on Ohio's newspaper industry, and we're going to hear from Free Press about how they help build a movement to support local news in New Jersey. And we will also hear from Common Cause about their efforts to stop a hedge fund takeover of the Dayton Daily News and some other newspapers and radio stations owned by Cox Enterprises. But first, you're going to hear from Zach and me. And then you're going to hear from Catherine Terser, the Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio, and Yosef Gedicho, Director of Media and Democracy at Common Cause. Common Cause Ohio works to improve elections, hold elected officials accountable, and create greater transparency in government. And Common Cause's Media and Democracy program works to advance open and affordable communication networks, promote a free press, and promote independent and diverse voices in our media. And lastly, we're going to hear from Madeline Baer, campaign manager for the New Voices program at Free Press, and Mike Rispoli. He is the New Voices director. And Free Press is a national advocacy organization that fights for positive social change, racial justice, and meaningful civic engagement through equitable access of technology, diverse independent ownership of media, and thriving public interest journalism. At the end, there will be questions, but you can just go ahead when questions come up, just chat them, put them into the chat function, and I'm going to be moderating or monitoring them, and we'll read them through in the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So let's get going. I'm going to start by sharing my screen for a presentation that Zach and I put together. Share my desktop. Did that work? No. Oh, sorry. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Here we go. Sorry. Okay, so this is the Policy Matters Ohio portion of the webinar, and it's based on our recent report called Breaking News, How Public Policy Can Support Journalism and Promote Democracy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Policy Matters, we're a nonprofit research institute that creates a more vibrant, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive Ohio through research, strategic communications, coalition building, and policy advocacy. I'd be remiss to not point you out to our social media stuff, where you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, sign up for our newsletter, all that. Please do all of that if you haven't already. Okay, and there's me and Zach. You saw us already. I am the communications director here, and Zach is the research director here. And Zach and I are also recovering journalists. I was a reporter at WCPN, well, a producer at WCPN, and my first job was at the Patriot Ledger, which is a newspaper outside of Boston. And Zach is definitely the more experienced journalist reporter. He was at the Plain Dealer and Business Week for 20 years. So we care a lot about newspapers, and we care a lot about the media. And in fact, if you look at our mission again, which is to create a more vibrant, sustainable, and thriving Ohio, we believe that newspapers are really, really important in achieving any of that. Recent studies have shown that newspapers, they're just, I didn't really know what else to show in this slide, so I put a bunch of icons up, but newspapers help government work better. They make City Hall be more efficient. Just having a reporter present at a City Hall meeting or a school board meeting can change the elected officials' behavior. A recent study showed that local government can become less efficient and accrue more debt when newspapers close. Studies have also shown that voter turnout declines when newspapers close. A recent study of the Cincinnati Post, which closed in 2007, showed that when that paper closed, voter turnout in the Kentucky suburbs, where the Post really covered, went down. Another study showed that partisanship goes up when local newspapers close because people rely more on national outlets. You also have things like less competition in mayoral races when newspapers close. And also, interestingly, one of the studies showed that pollution declines in communities that have, a polluting entity like a factory or something like that. Because if a newspaper is paying attention and holding the owner of that company accountable, they're less likely to pollute. So there is a lot at stake for this, and that's why we think it's really important to our mission of Policy Matters to pay attention to it. And also, frankly, newspapers are a main way that we get our work out into the world and a way that we're able to get policymakers to pay attention to the research and the recommendations we come up with. But sadly, since 2004, Ohio has 32% fewer newspapers. Most of them are weeklies that have closed, but of course, we all know about the Vindicator, and I just mentioned the Cincinnati Post. And along, of course, with those newspapers closing, that means a loss of jobs. And it's not just the closing of newspapers, it's also the consolidation, the cutbacks, and the mergers. But as you can see here, we've had a huge decline in newspaper industry jobs in Ohio between 2004 and 2017. It's about 58% drop in all jobs in the industry. And that includes everybody from reporters and editors to people delivering the paper or people working in circulation and people staffing as secretaries or taking calls. Oops. We also focused a little bit more deliberately in our report on the newsroom staff. And for our purposes, the newsroom staff included the people who were out there collecting the news, editing the news, photographing the news, and laying it out on the page. We call those the newsroom jobs. Huge declines of these positions in the last 6 years between 2012 and 2018. And as you can see here, we also took a look at the pay because it's pretty important to note that the people that are doing this work are skilled professionals, and in many cases, they're expected to have college degrees, they're expected to have a vehicle, they're expected to work long hours, and as you can see, they're not getting paid that great, and it's getting worse. And just for, laughs, I thought I would check one of the old websites I used to check when I was working in journalism, journalismjobs.org, and I saw a reporter posting in Logan County, Ohio for a job that paid less than $23,000 a year. And I think that tells you about what's going on with the industry there. So why is this happening? What are the things that we're seeing? And the interesting thing is, although the data is showing us that we're losing newspaper jobs, newspapers are closing, a recent study by Pew found that 71% of Americans believe that their local news outlets are doing very or somewhat well financially. It's just not the case. And a lot of it is because advertising revenue for publicly traded newspapers company dropped by 13% between 2017 and 2018. And that was really the bread and butter of newspapers for many years. But as things are shifting to online and that's becoming more important, newspapers haven't quite figured out a way to capitalize on that. But who has, as you can see here, Facebook and Google are doing quite well. Overall, they sucked up about 60% of digital ad revenue last year, and that's 60% of over $100 billion. And locally, in local markets, they get about 77% of digital ad revenue, a huge chunk. And newspapers just aren't getting their fair share of that. And another thing to keep in mind, like I said about the ads, Craigslist.org, we've all probably gone onto it maybe to find an apartment or a lawnmower or whatever. But when Craigslist comes to town, a study showed that newspapers are 10% more likely to close. And that's because the ads, the classifieds, the things that used to place in newspapers, it's all going on to Craigslist now. Another important reason why newspapers are struggling so much is the prevalence of major media conglomerates and hedge funds, or a hedge fund type model that are coming in and seeing newspapers in difficult situations and seeing opportunities to slash, cut, and squeeze to make as much money as they can. Each year, the nation loses about 100 newspaper companies, and that's mostly as bigger companies are taking over. Ohio, we have a lot of this going on. 5 of the nation's largest newspaper chains in Gatehouse, Gannett, Adams, AIM, and Ogden own nearly 120 papers in Ohio. One of the reports we cite heavily in our report, a report done by the UNC in North Carolina, said that Ohio has the most feverishly paced merger and consolidation activity in the nation. We're going to talk a bit about that right now. Up here you see a map of counties that are covered by papers owned by Gannett and Gatehouse. And Gatehouse Media owns the Columbus Dispatch, it owns the Akron Beacon Journal and the Canton Repository, and about 50 weekly papers. You can see they're there in yellow. Gannett is also owned by Gannett owns USA Today, and here in Ohio, it owns the Cincinnati Enquirer and about 10 different weeklies, mostly in central Ohio. Now these two companies, and Gatehouse, I should mention, it's very important, is managed by a hedge fund called Fortress Investments. And the Gatehouse model has been very much consolidate, cut, and outsource. And that's a model we see adopted by other companies as well. And so Gatehouse right now is attempting, or has, I think there's a little bit left to be done with the deal, and Joseph can probably talk about this, but is taking over Gannett. And when that happens, you'll see that a quarter of the counties in Ohio are going to have papers, assuming that the papers remain, owned by one mega company. And 2 immediate questions come to mind. So the Cincinnati Enquirer has a State House News Bureau, so does the Columbus Dispatch. What happens to that State House News Bureau? And all the weeklies that overlap, the weeklies owned by Gatehouse that overlap with the dailies owned by Gannett, what happens to them? I'm sure there are many more things to wonder about, but those are 2 immediate things I thought of. This map here shows you how many people will be affected by this. The size of the circle corresponds with the size of the circulation. And one thing that we don't have included in this map that maybe we should have is the impending, or now I think thwarted, takeover of the Dayton Daily News and other papers and outlets owned by Cox Enterprises by the Apollo Hedge Fund. And the reason that's connected to this is because the Apollo Hedge Fund is financing the merger between Gatehouse and Gannett. And it's just absolutely dizzying, and it's hard to keep up with it. But one thing that's clear, I think, is that the private market alone, leaving the news business to the private market alone, is not serving the people of Ohio. And that's where Zach and his recommendations come in.
Okay, so glad to talk with all of you today. Obviously, you can read all of this in our report, which is available on our website. But to talk a little bit about some of the things that have been going on, because there is, I think, a good deal of activity of people who are seeing this and are trying to do something about it. In Youngstown, we've seen moves by existing media as well as some national players to try and fill some of the void left by the death of the old Vindicator. And we see a number of other projects underway elsewhere in Ohio. For instance, here in Cleveland, the Cleveland Foundation, in partnership with the Center for Collaborative Media and the Akron Community Foundation, recently hosted a day-long workshop with a group of journalists and resident media makers to discuss ways to strengthen local news in Cleveland and Akron. The retired head of the media department at Miami University is seeking to support for a Report for Ohio pilot program in Southwest Ohio. These are just a couple of the things going on, which is certainly worthy of our support. And I think hopefully we'll see more of these creative ideas. There's also an outfit called Eye on Ohio that's a nonprofit journalism entity. I think that while it's important and these are crucial things to support and that we very much need, they can't be expected to fill the entire void that we're experiencing that Caitlin has outlined. Public policy and investment needs to be a part of this solution. So we outlined a number of suggestions. Some of them are at the federal level, which you can read on your screen. I won't really go over them in any great detail. One of them includes taxing Facebook and Google to create a fund that could support independent journalism. And I would add that Ohio itself could adopt a policy where we're at least not providing additional subsidies to these companies, which we've been doing through the data centers that they operate around the state. The couple of things that we wanted to focus on here today, I'm going to talk primarily about public broadcasting and public radio, and then later we're going to hear from Free Press about what they've accomplished in New Jersey. Basically, we think that the General Assembly should build on its longstanding appropriations and boost support for public broadcasting by $5 million a year. This next slide shows you, it's a couple of years old, so it's a rough approximation, but it basically shows you the reach of public radio across Ohio. And what it shows you is that while it doesn't cover every last piece of ground, every one of Ohio's 88 counties is at least partly covered by public radio. This is something that is already covering most of the state. The state has supported it for decades, and there is an infrastructure of news operations in the place, including the 3-person State House News Bureau, which many of you probably hear. It also allows for not only a digital presence, but Ohioans who don't have good broadband access can hear it. So it means that we have a significant issue with that in Ohio, and we wouldn't want to just come up with a digital alternative that wasn't reachable by everyone. Interestingly, some of the major public radio stations in the state have a grant-funded effort to develop a statewide news collaboration. And that's, I think, something well worth watching. They're only just doing some feasibility study on it. Together, the 3 largest of those stations have about 50 news staff now, while some of the others don't have any at all. So while it isn't clear yet what this initiative will lead to, it could mean placing reporters in rural areas, it could mean sharing news stories, it could mean even statewide newscasts. This is happening in other states, and I think that probably next year they'll be looking for funding to support this initiative. The fact is that state spending for public broadcasting is very well established across the country. Ohio is one of 23 states that directly supports both public radio and TV. In total, we're spending $4.3 million a year in Ohio now on public broadcasting, about $1.3 million of which goes to public radio. However, that funding is not nearly as great as in some other states, including our neighbor Kentucky. South Dakota, Mississippi, Utah rely on state support for more than half of their public broadcasting funding. And the amounts per capita that are spent in some of these more rural states is many times what it is in Ohio. I think what this indicates is that we really have an opportunity to boost this significantly. If you look at the numbers on the screen a little more closely, that 681,000 number includes the funding that goes directly to stations around the state. Only 2 stations in fiscal 2019 got over $100,000, and all of the others were well below that. So while that's helpful, it's clearly not enough to provide meaningful news gathering. We need to boost this and consider doing so before the next biennial state budget, which is more than a year and a half away. Thanks very much, and we can now move ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And now we're going to pass it over to our friends at Common Cause, and they'll expand a little bit on what we were starting to say about Apollo and Cox and all of the dizzying stuff that's going on with that.
So this is Catherine Terser from Common Cause, Ohio. So, Common Cause, works to create open, honest, and accountable government. And of course, democracy works best when we all have really good information. And so it was really clear to us that we needed a strong media and democracy program. And so I'm joined here with Joseph Gadachu is here with me. He's the director of the Media and Democracy Program, and he's going to walk us through some kind of recent things that have happened. There's an interesting update from the Third Circuit Court, and as we think about how overwhelming this problem is, it can feel like, okay, how do we actually address this? It just kind of feels really overwhelming. But we are a state where people came together over and over to address gerrymandering. The first redistricting reform ballot measure was in 1981. And the persistence of Ohioans led to measures in, ballot measures and signature collecting in 2005, again in 2012. And then we finally moved the state legislature to action, and it really, completely felt like a miracle after all that hard work. But it wasn't a miracle. It was because of the persistence of Ohioans. And it was because of this view that we care about elections, we care about our government, and we just kept going. And so when we hit a point where the legislature wasn't going to take action on congressional redistricting reform, you all know, we collected a bunch of signatures. And then together, we actually changed democracy for the better when we voted to pass congressional redistricting reform in May of 2018. And so I think all of this context about media and democracy can feel really overwhelming. But this is really the beginning of a conversation for many of us about what we can do, because many of us have kind of waited for newspapers to figure out and sort this out themselves. But it's going to take more than just newspapers. It's going to take all of us thinking about solutions and having conversations about solutions. And so I'm actually going to hand it over to a media and democracy expert, Joseph. And Joseph, why don't you take it away? Tell them a little bit about yourself and like what your kind of work has been, and tell us a little bit about what's happening nationally. And thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So, hey everyone, my name is Joseph Getachew. I am the director of the Media and Democracy Program at Common Cause. And our Media and Democracy Program focuses on keeping communications networks open and affordable, defending a free press, and promoting independent and diverse voices in our media system. So just to pick up where Catherine left off, the real reason why media and democracy is so important, because we need news and information to make informed decisions about our democracy. The issues Catherine raised about gerrymandering, those issues don't get uncovered if we don't have actual investigative reporting or journalists on the ground covering what's going on in the state legislature, the local legislature. So this is part of a national issue where we're facing a crisis in journalism. We heard a little bit earlier about the crisis in Ohio. It's going on nationally with massive layoffs and consolidated newsrooms. And this is tied in with the wave of media consolidation going on nationally, where you have big media conglomerates acquiring other big media conglomerates just for the cause of getting bigger. And we've been very active nationally in trying to fight these mergers. The big one we were successful in killing off last year was the Sinclair merger. If folks don't know, Sinclair had tried to acquire Tribune about a year or so ago. And Sinclair is notorious for airing these must-run segments in their local television stations where the anchors just read off scripts from corporate headquarters. They tend to be xenophobic, Islamophobic, racist, or just extremely conservative, and not actually representing the views of the community or giving community needs. And this is really the problem when you have just a handful of entities owning so much of our media. And again, Sinclair is just one. there are so many others going on right now. Nexstar Tribune was recently approved by the FCC last week, unfortunately, but that's a merger we were active in trying to oppose. And what's going on in Ohio right now? Apollo, a private equity firm, is trying to buy Cox Media. Cox has owned a television station and a newspaper in Dayton for quite some time, and owns TV stations and radio stations in other parts of the country. Apollo is trying to acquire Cox along with Northwest Broadcasting. If it does acquire Cox, it would own about 25 television stations. And if it acquires Northwest Broadcasting along with that merger, it would own about another 40 or so television stations, where it could potentially become the 7th largest media conglomerate in the country when it comes to owning local television stations. So why is this dangerous? A couple of reasons. What we've seen is that private equity firms really don't care about actually serving the community when it comes to local news, or even any other business for that matter. Private equity typically sees an area that is ripe for investment, or for a vulture capitalist style takeover, where they can just take over, squeeze the profits out of that entity, and sell it off for scraps down the line. And that's really what they're seeing through from local news. Private equity is seeing that local news is going through this crisis in journalism, where there's a bunch of consolidation going on, but there's still a lot of money to be made. When you look at advertising dollars, that is really a big source of revenue for television, particularly when it comes to political season. In the 2018 elections, advertising revenue raised the most money off of local television, not actually Facebook and Google, surprisingly. So it still shows you that local news is a big revenue stream. Local television is a big revenue stream. And you have the Apollo CEO actually saying that, local television elects senators. And that kind of shows you their mentality when it comes to why they want to get into this space. It's not actually serving the needs of our community. There's no actual promises they made where they'll bolster local news, they'll bolster the amount of journalists they hire. What we can typically see is that they're going to lay off more reporters, they're going to consolidate newsrooms, and they're going to take the cuts from that and put that money back into their shareholders or their C-suite, which is against the public interest and something our community doesn't need. So we actually held an event in Dayton, Ohio about a month or so ago, where we got a bunch of community activists together and held a panel with the mayor of Dayton, along with other stakeholders, to talk about the dangers of this merger, to talk about a private equity firm taking over the newspaper and the television station in Dayton, as well as other entities across the country. And it raised a lot of concerns, a lot of questions about what's going on in the media, not just with the Apollo takeover, but what do people want to see from local news? For folks who don't know, Cox has owned the Dayton television station and the Dayton Daily News for quite a while, and they've actually consolidated both the newspaper and the television station into one newsroom, or at least one building that hosts both for quite a while. And what we've heard on the ground is that sometimes a reporter for the television station may be covering something from the newspaper, or vice versa, where you'll have a reporter for the newspaper sitting in at an event, and then whatever notes they take, whatever clip they film, will be used for the local television station segment later on that evening. And that's really the danger when it comes to consolidation. You have less local news, less deep dive investigative reporting, and just less locally originated programming to begin with. And that's what we can probably expect from Apollo's takeover of Cox. So in terms of timing, Apollo is in the process of acquiring Cox. The Federal Communications Commission is reviewing the merger. We at Common Cause and Common Cause Ohio filed a petition to deny that merger. We also collected signatures from the community in the Ohio area, which generated about 500 or so comments opposed to the merger. So we're actively looking to kill this, and we're looking for as much support as possible in that. So on a related note to the Apollo-Cox merger, it's what's going on nationally. I mentioned that there's been a wave of consolidation, whether it's Nexstar Tribune, Apollo-Cox, CBS, Viacom just announced they want to merge, Gannett Gatehouse, as was discussed earlier. A lot of these mergers have been possible because the FCC relaxed a lot of its media ownership rules back in 2017. There were rules in place that prohibited cross-ownership between a newspaper and a television station, cross ownership between radio stations and television stations, or just limits on how many television stations one company could own in a local market. So what the FCC did in 2017 was just say, let's just get rid of most of these and create a framework where one company could own the only newspaper, the top television stations, and the top radio stations in a local market. That just shows you how much power these media companies have and how important it is that we have a diverse and independent set of voices in our media system. So we at Common Cause, along with Free Press and several other organizations, sued the FCC back in 2018 for relaxing these rules. Our argument was that the FCC did not consider the impact on race and gender diversity, race and gender ownership diversity in the media when they rolled these rules back. So we filed our petition, a petitioner's brief, and just this week we got a decision from the Third Circuit throwing out the FCC's media ownership rollbacks. It's a major win for us and a major win for the public interest. And I'll just mention a few things what the court said. They specifically said the FCC did not consider the impact on race and gender ownership diversity when it rolled back a lot of these rules. And just for history, this has been a long set of litigation, a long set of cases where we and other organizations have constantly sued the FCC when they've rolled back the rules, telling the court they didn't actually consider the impact on diverse ownership. And every time, this is now the fourth time now, the court has said, you're right, the FCC has not considered this. And just for context, currently ownership diversity is incredibly dismal. Women own about 7% of television stations. African Americans, I believe, own about 0.9% of television stations. Latinos own about 4.5%. And Native Americans and other minority communities own less than 0.1%, I believe. It's incredibly dismal. And that's just the data we have on the books. The other big issue is that this data is not robust enough and not complete enough. And that's something we kept telling the FCC. And the court agreed with us. The court said the FCC's analysis of its diversity ownership data couldn't pass the muster of a first-year statistics class, which just goes to show you how inadequate the FCC is really looking into this and why it's a big deal. So it's a big win for us. It means that very soon the rules will be back on the books, and it should put the brakes on some of the mergers we've been seeing and some of the consolidation we've been seeing. It may also cause companies like Apollo to kind of restructure their deal now that these rules are going to be back on the books down the line very soon. And so it's a big win for us, and it's something we're going to keep pushing for to make sure these rules stay on the books, to make sure we have adequate rules that give multiple voices a chance to be represented in the media, not just one big company that can control everything.
Thank you so much, Joseph and Catherine. That's really exciting and inspiring work. So happy that you all are doing it. And now we are going to hear from the folks at Free Press about the exciting work that they did in New Jersey. So why don't, I think, Madeline, are you taking it away first?
Sure. Hi there. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a lot of looking at a screen, so I really look forward to your questions and ideas and discussion afterwards. I am Madeline Baer, and together with my colleague Mike Rispoli, we're going to share the work of Free Press's News Voices program to advance policies for public funding to support local news. So I'll just briefly give you an overview of the News Voices program. Free Press is a national advocacy organization founded in 2003, fighting for equitable access to technology and means of communication to advance racial equity, social change, and meaningful civic engagement. We launched News Voices in 2015 to bring the public into conversation about the future of local news. For the past decade plus, there's been an ongoing conversation about the future of journalism, and I'm sure many of you on the call have been a part of these conversations, but usually these conversations are among journalists and maybe media executives and academics. But to build a sustainable future for journalism, the public needs to be part of those conversations. If we want the public to support news, whether through subscriptions or memberships or trust or policy change, they need to be at the table. And you can move the slide, Mike. We think of community members as not just news consumers, but as constituents for journalism. They can either be dismissive of the decline of local news because they don't see themselves in the media, or they don't see how local media outlets benefit them, or by bringing them to the table, incorporating the concerns, ideas, and information needs of community members, they can be champions for supporting and revitalizing local news. And so News Voices works in two different ways to build a constituency for local journalism. We believe that both culture change and policy change is necessary to build this constituency to support local news from the ground up. In terms of culture change, we work with newsrooms and communities to strengthen the relationship between the two. And I won't talk much about this, but if you're interested in learning more, you can read case studies about this work on newsvoices.org. And for the newsrooms that we've worked with, they've really seen this bear fruit, that when journalists invest in communities, communities are willing to invest in journalism. But we also recognize the need to invest in public policies to support media in the public interest. The business model that Yosef just outlined, the business model that incentivizes clickbait and sensationalism, and which has led to newsrooms shrinking and shuttering across the country, is part of the reason that so many people lack trust and lack support for local news. And so while nonprofit newsrooms have emerged in many communities, they've not been able to fill the gaps that have been left by shrinking newsrooms. And they have proven sustainable primarily when they serve affluent communities. And so we see public funding as a way to address many of these critical gaps in local journalism. So with that, I'll pass it to Mike to talk about what a campaign for public funding for local news looked like in New Jersey.
Yeah, hey everyone. I'm Mike Rispoli. I'm the News Voices Director for Free Press. Been working on the News Voices project since 2015, since it started. Before that, I was a longtime journalist in New Jersey, covered the State House for Gannett newspapers, was an editor and online reporter for the Star Ledger of Newark as well. So I have a background in journalism, but most recently have been organizing to strengthen journalism as well as trying to get communities more involved and helping newsrooms better respond to the concerns of the communities they serve. And so before we talk about the Civic Info Bill campaign, I want to share a little bit of information about the local news crisis in New Jersey. In a lot of ways, it looks like what's going on in Ohio. So New Jersey, for a very long time, has always been over-reliant on print media. And that's because it is sandwiched in between two of the largest broadcast media markets in the country, New York and Philadelphia. New Jersey also has 565 municipalities in a very small state, which means a lot of local government, which requires local news, community-based news, reporters at city council meetings and covering planning boards and all those things. And so with media consolidation, with the downturn in print media, New Jersey was hit especially hard with the changes that we've been seeing in the local news landscape for the better part of a decade. To the point where thousands of journalists have been laid off in the state, dozens of newsrooms have closed down, and even attempts to better get local news to New Jersey residents have failed. For instance, Facebook has launched this thing called Today In, which it was its attempt to address news deserts by delivering local news to Facebook users. But the problem was that they couldn't actually do it in New Jersey because 60% of Facebook users in New Jersey don't actually have access to local news. And so it's a really significant problem in the state, which is why when we started News Voices, New Jersey was a very natural place to start to think about how communities and journalists could work together to figure out what the future of news would look like in the state. And as we were doing this work, this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity presented itself in the state. Back in 2010, then Governor Chris Christie sold off the public media television station in New Jersey Network. But it actually held on to the licenses, those TV licenses. And so in 2017, there was a national auction of television licenses around the country. New Jersey participated in that auction at 4 TV licenses that it sold for about $332 million. A significant amount of money was coming into the state of New Jersey from the sale of media. And because we had been for about 2 years at that point, working around the state, talking to people, building up a statewide network of people who were really interested in local media issues, we thought, could we actually turn this network of people into a grassroots movement to make sure that a portion of the money that the state of New Jersey was about to receive could actually be reinvested back into communities and could actually target news deserts and underserved communities in the state. And so it was very clear that people's needs weren't being met. There weren't enough media outlets. The state of New Jersey was about to receive hundreds of millions of dollars. And so we organized a campaign that we called the Civic Info Bill campaign. And the idea was to create a public fund to revive, strengthen, and transform media in New Jersey that would invest millions of dollars into innovative news technology and civic engagement projects. And so through consultation with lots of people around the state, we helped conceive of this idea, the Civic Information Consortium, which would be a newly created public charity that would receive $100 million over 5 years, partner with universities to actually invest in these projects. Anyone could apply for a grant and then would be paired with a university to receive additional resources. So for instance, universities that were participating in the consortium would have to add an additional 10% to whatever grants were made out to people. Because this was public funding, and we were obviously concerned with any sort of government meddling in how those funds would be used, or not wanting politicians to interfere in the editorial process, we put firewalls in place to protect against government interference, a large bipartisan board, making it an independent 501c3 and not actually a part of the state government, allowed for it to also raise additional funds outside of whatever sort of initial investment came in. It was important for us that this money be focused on underserved communities. And so yes, news deserts, yes, communities that have recently lost local news, but also communities that were never really well served by local media, in particular communities of color in the state. And the reason why the idea was to create a public fund where anyone could apply for a grant, and that money not just going towards local news, but also things like news literacy programs, like civic technology, was just a recognition that every community has a different set of needs, and really wanting this fund to be designed to best meet that community's needs. And so what we did in 2017 was we held 10 forums around the state. We talked to hundreds of residents about what their information needs were, what the loss of local news has meant to them, how that has maybe harmed their communities, and talking to them just about the fact that the state of New Jersey was about to receive hundreds of millions of dollars from the sale of media, and how would they want that money to actually be spent. It was something that was happening that pretty much no one was talking about until we began this campaign. And so we thought it was important that, this is taxpayer money. People should know that the state's about to receive this, and we think that they should have a say in how that money is spent. And it was a really great experience because it allowed for us to have a conversation with people about the absence of local news, the value of local news, and also like the failures of local journalism. How could this money be used to not just be a bailout for journalists or for newsrooms, but also how could this money be used to reinvent what local news looked like in the state? And, you know, as a part of that, you know, we gained hundreds of perspectives around what people's needs were. And in a really, you know, I think a really exciting way, we heard from people lots of ideas about how if they were to apply for a grant from the consortium, what would they use that money for? And it really made it concrete and tangible. You know, this wasn't just, you know, some public fund that would give money out, you know, and seemingly like somewhat abstract. This is, you know, coming up with these ideas for how communities could actually use this money to better inform their community. Not only got people invested in the idea and the campaign, but also allowed for us when we did lobby lawmakers, it actually, we could say, hey, your constituents want this money to be used to better serve the community. Here are all the ideas that they're coming up with. It really strengthened our argument when we were doing that work. And it really helped us build a grassroots network of people who were invested and excited about the idea. And again, was something that, you know, wasn't really happening in the state at the time. I think a lot of folks were dismissive of the idea originally. They said, you know, no one cares about local journalism. You know, no one's going to want to see, you know, politicians giving money to local news. Why would politicians give money to journalists? But I think what we showed is that, you know, you can actually build campaigns around this, especially when you're not necessarily talking about journalism, but you're really talking about the health of a community. Like Caitlin was mentioning before, you know, there are really significant impacts on communities when local news disappears. And if we make this more about, you know, the health, the democratic and civic health of our communities, and not so much about saving journalism, people got really excited about that idea, and it made them want to actually take action. And they did take action. People signed petitions. Thousands of people in New Jersey signed petitions. They testified before budget committees. They called their lawmakers. They wrote letters. They dropped into their representatives' offices. They joined in online conversations. People got activated in support of something to support local news, not something that you see every day. But because we were able to really make this not about journalism, but about communities across New Jersey, people took action, took time out of their day to want to make a difference. And, you know, here's a great shot of us at the State House. You know, we held lobby days in the State House where, you know, we talk to politicians about the idea, about the need to make sure that New Jersey actually used some of this money that it was getting to support local news, and specifically to create the Civic Information Consortium. And in June of 2017, only a few months from launching this campaign, we actually got the Civic Info Bill introduced. It had 15 co-sponsors. The Senate Majority Leader and the Assembly Majority Leader were the prime sponsors on the bill, so it actually had some political heft in the State House. And the reason why we were able to get them was we were strategic about how we were approaching them. The Senate Majority Leader lived in a district that Gannett had recently bought out and gutted a paper there. The Assembly Majority Leader lived in a news desert. So they were actually seeing what the loss of local news and how that was impacting their communities. And we were able to gain a significant amount of political support for this idea in only a short matter of months. And so in June of 2017, the Civic Info Bill is introduced. The state of New Jersey has $332 million it's about to receive. And Governor Chris Christie said, no. He basically said, hey, you know, the state's receiving $332 million. I'm going to use all but $10 million of that money to plug all the different budget holes. And so the state of New Jersey, unfortunately, has squandered that once in a lifetime opportunity. They used all but $10 million of that money to plug budget holes, leaving $10 million aside for future communications and media projects. It was a real hard thing to take after we had built all this movement, but we decided that, you know, we built this statewide network of people who were really engaged on this issue, so we just decided to do it all over again. It was Chris Christie's last year. We built on the previous campaign. We did more events, got more actions, more people testifying, gained more lawmaker support. A new governor, the current governor, Phil Murphy, came into office after that. He was a Democrat. The legislature is overwhelmingly Democrats, and so we felt like there was a good political moment too for us to hopefully advance this idea. And so even though most of that money had been squandered, we got the bill reintroduced, and we were able to convince lawmakers to introduce a budget resolution for $5 million. So about half of the money that was left over from the sale of the TV licenses. Now, that is a significant decrease from that original $100 million, but given that there was essentially, you know, very little money left, you know, we thought, well, $5 million could still, you know, make a significant impact as a seed investment. Hopefully it could go from there. You know, what was really exciting was that the Civic Info Bill passed with broad bipartisan support in June of 2018, after only a little over a year of campaigning for this, which, you know, doesn't happen all the time, but I think that given the overwhelming support from the public, and probably that lawmakers were surprised that people actually cared about the state of local journalism in New Jersey, that we were able to get the Civic Info Bill passed. All but in the Senate of New Jersey, it received support from 49 out of the 50 senators. So all, you know, show that this isn't really a partisan issue, that this is something that really affects local communities no matter what their political affiliation was. And then really the best part about passing the Civic Info Bill was that, you know, we got a chance to party with Beyonce, as you can see in these gifts here. So this is basically a live shot of us the night that the Civic Info Bill passed. And we were over the moon. We couldn't believe it, because, like I said, when we started this campaign, no one thought this was going to happen. We were told by folks that there was no shot, and so you know, when it passed, we partied like Beyonce. But then only a few weeks later, Governor Murphy, who had signed the bill and appropriated the money, said, "Hey, you know what? Money's actually not there. Sorry." So after this, like, you know, up, we got the bill introduced, and then it was down, the money is not there. And then we got the bill passed and signed into law, and then the money's not there. And so it's been a real roller coaster ride of a campaign. So the money that the governor had allocated was in fact not there in the end. And so we had to once again do it again. And it's just really starting to, you know, seriously, come on, Governor Murphy. But, you know, where things are right now, we're still campaigning for this. The bill was passed and signed into law, but really what we're campaigning for is to make sure that the money that the state has previously set aside actually goes to the consortium. And the unfortunate part is that that money keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So like most recently, they passed a budget with $2 million. But because the consortium was created, the universities are working together to make board appointments and implement the law and set up the infrastructure. You know, we're still campaigning to not only get the money for the consortium, but to also really get the public input on funding priorities and working with other foundations to raise additional funds. And, I wish that there was a neater, cleaner ending to this campaign. But I think, we've learned a lot over the past few years about how you can actually engage the public on creating public policy that supports local journalism. And I think it's important to share some of those lessons that we've learned in New Jersey over this past few years. And I think the first one is really that we need to really rethink public funding for media in response to new needs. I think that, there is a really important opportunity for us right now, as we were thinking about the future of local news, to really make sure that public funding is a part of that discussion. I think it's very clear, based on everything we've heard today, and I'm sure folks who are interested in this can see, is that there is a pretty significant market failure going on in journalism right now, and it is not going to fix itself. And this is not just any old industry, this is the fourth estate, right? This is something that is necessary in order for communities to engage in political processes, to engage in democracy. And it is not something that we should just let the market figure out, that we need actual policies to ensure that communities have the news and information they need so they can stay civically engaged. And public funding is one way to do that. And I think that we need to really reimagine how public funding is used to support local news and build on the 50-plus-year legacy of public funding in the United States, and adapt it for the 21st century. Adapt it for how communities consume information, disseminate information now, with a particular emphasis on underserved communities. And I think another thing that we learned is that even if, especially folks in the journalism space, like this, like no one cares about journalism, is that even if people don't care about journalism, they do care about how their community gets information. They care very deeply about how stories of their community are told. And the less that we focus on how hard the loss of local news has been on the journalism industry and focus more about how hard it's been on communities, you can actually get people really invested in this. Like Madeline said at the beginning, we need to, as journalists, as people who are in the media space, we really need to stop centering journalism in this conversation. We need to center communities and the harm that has been created in these communities with the loss of local news. And I think that's hard sometimes for journalists, who, their livelihood is dependent on the journalism industry. I get it. But I think if we want to actually get people caring about the future of local journalism, we need to focus more on communities and a little less on ourselves. And it's really important for underserved and marginalized communities to be involved. We need to really dispel this notion of the good old days of journalism, because the good old days of journalism weren't great for a lot of folks, in particular underserved and marginalized communities. And I think that if we are thinking about what the future of local news looks like, we need to really address the fact that a lot of communities have been left out of the journalistic process, that a lot of communities have been maligned or misrepresented by local news. And instead of having arguments about that or getting defensive, we should look at that as an opportunity to change what journalism looks like and to call those communities in and be more involved in it. And for instance, in New Jersey, the New Jersey Press Association and the Society of Professional Journalists did not endorse the Civic Info Bill, but who did endorse the Civic Info Bill were all of the Spanish language media outlets in the state. It was all the Black-owned media outlets in the state. It was immigration rights groups. It was student journalists associations. So people who had a stake in the future of journalism were the ones who endorsed it, especially folks from underserved and marginalized communities. I think it's important to say, and it's pretty obvious, that passing legislation is super hard. I'm sure the Policy Matters Ohio folks and Common Cause folks know that. Passing legislation is hard, and passing legislation with money attached can be even harder. So even though we got a lot of buy-in from politicians on the idea of the Civic Info Bill, its biggest challenge has been the money that actually needs to go to it. And so even as we believe that public funding is a really important thing for the future of local journalism, I think it's important for us to also consider other public policies that can support local news that maybe don't have money attached to it. And I think that we need a whole host of different things, but we also need to, while we also need funding, there's also lots of other policies we should begin to consider to make sure that there is a future for local news to better serve communities. And I think the last thing is just like really important, probably good life advice as well. It's just like, don't listen to the haters. I cannot tell you how many people told us that this was the worst idea ever. I mean, when we started this campaign, I got laughed out of the Assembly Majority Office when I first met with them. They said, no one cares about journalism, and with that emphasis, like no one cares about this, it's never gonna happen. we went into newsrooms to talk to journalists, and they said, people aren't going to, organize to support us. No one cares about journalism. And then, I don't know if it's just because I'm from New Jersey and I kind of have a permanent chip on my shoulder, but I kind of, I took that as a challenge. And I think what we showed is that if you center people and you're smart about how you run a campaign, and you try to bring as many people into the process as possible, you can achieve things that even a few months before that seemed like they were impossible. And I really want us to hold on to that, because I think as we are going to begin seeing more and more movements to support local news in states like Ohio and elsewhere, there's going to be a lot of resistance and pushback and people saying this is a terrible idea. But if there is a need for this to happen, then we need to not listen to those haters and organize and actually try to make a difference with this. And so I'm going to pass it back to Madeline about some of those movements that I just mentioned that we're actually starting to see pop up around the country when it comes to local news.
Great, thanks, Mike. So just to close up quickly and then open it up for your questions and thoughts. Since passing the Civic Info Bill, we've heard a lot of interest from others working on solutions to the local news crisis in their own communities. And at Free Press, we want to support those local partners elsewhere to envision and lead campaigns for public policies to support local news. And we also recognize that what worked in New Jersey may not be the most strategic or viable or appropriate solution elsewhere. And so we're really eager to learn from our partners at Policy Matters Ohio, from Common Cause, and from those of you on the call who are exploring solutions in Ohio, so that we can learn what particular opportunities and challenges may present themselves in terms of public policies in the state of Ohio. And we're also following and learning from, and in some cases supporting movements and public policy solutions elsewhere. I won't go through each of these because I'm just conscious of time, but I'm happy to share more. Some of our colleagues have explored and put out a white paper looking at a platform ad tax to generate revenue for reporting, and that has been adopted by the Bernie Sanders platform and possibly other platforms of current presidential nominees or candidates. We're working with partners in Massachusetts who are following and working to strengthen a proposal to study local news in underserved communities there. And then there are also municipal solutions that may or may not be framed as supporting local journalism, but effectively are ways to do that. One that has gained traction and attention is called the Information District, which is to create special districts to fund civic information projects that are responsive to local needs. And then there are many solutions outside of this country where other countries have invested hundreds of times more than the US in publicly funded local news. And so there are initiatives that are pretty recent in New Zealand and the UK and the Netherlands that fund local reporters to work with independent outlets to address some of the local news gaps. And so finally, I'll just say, and Mike talked about this as well, that, we really hold to our heart two core values when we are exploring and advocating for public policy solutions to address journalism. And the first is that, these policies and funds must center communities and their local news and information needs, and not center the journalism industry. And the second being that, any campaigns and legislation really must involve public engagement, because no one knows better what sorts of news and information communities need than community members themselves. And so they really need to be at the table as key stakeholders in drafting solutions. So I'm just going to leave it there. We can just leave on the screen for a second the contact information for Mike and myself. And I know that was a lot hearing from all of us, but we're really eager to hear your questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Madeline and Mike. I personally am very inspired. Both Zach and I were sitting here nodding with almost everything you all were saying. Really amazing work in New Jersey, and don't let the roller coaster get you down. Believe me, we know. We did have a couple questions come in, and I'd like if other folks have questions, please ask them, and we have some time left to respond. So first one that came in during the Common Cause presentation, and I think this one is really for Yosef, is there a law that explicitly protects diversity of ownership? If you have an answer for that. Oh, do I need to unmute you? I can do that. Oh.
I found the button. Yeah, so there is a statute that requires the FCC to promote race and gender diversity when it considers its media ownership rules. So not to parse words, but the basic idea is you have to consider the impact of race and gender diversity. You have to actually do something to improve the state of race and gender diversity when it comes to media ownership. So over the years, the FCC has taken a number of attempts to collect data and conduct studies when it comes to diverse ownership. When it comes to data, the FCC has a form called Form 323 that all broadcasters are required to fill out, and it has questions on there regarding diversity. But the problem is that the form is flawed, and the data that the FCC collects from this form is flawed for a number of reasons. Over the years, there was issues of not every broadcaster would fill out the form, not every broadcaster would fully fill out the form, or the data was varied. So there's a lot of issues with that. And then the studies that the FCC has conducted over the past several years have not been fully adequate too. And they've conducted studies based on various aspects of diversity. So to get back to your main question, there is a statute that does require the FCC to promote race and gender diversity. And to be blunt, they just haven't done it when it comes to their media ownership rules.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple more. Great, more questions coming in. This question requires a little context. It says, I won't read the whole thing, I'll paraphrase, but it says we fund arts at the county level. This means in Cuyahoga County with the tax that operates outside any budget appropriations process. It is a tax on cigarettes. It's, it has issues of equity and other things, and it's a declining revenue source, but it generates money and it funds the arts. Have any states or communities successfully created a dedicated tax to fund journalism? If not, why not? In the next 18 months, the art community will likely seek a second dedicated revenue stream by approaching the voters. If we can convince voters to approve a sin tax for the arts, can we find a similar budget-proof source for journalism? So that could be free. I mean, I guess that could be for open to anyone that might have some thoughts about that. But I think particularly the free press folks.
I would just also add, this is in Cuyahoga County that this is the case in Cleveland. So others around the state may not have exactly the same situation.
Yeah, I can take that to begin with. That's a great question. And there are certainly a lot of ways that state humanities funds fund storytelling and documentary projects that are often bordering or overlapping on journalism projects. And one thing that I included in that last slide around other public policy solutions that we're following is something I learned of just last week when I was in the Boulder region in Colorado, that the residents of the city of Boulder passed a municipal tax that would fund local projects, both, it was a handful of projects, some of which were from city agencies, and others were from local nonprofits that went through a commission and were improved to receive funding from this tax. And one of those nonprofit organizations was the local community radio station. And so I haven't seen myself taxes that are specifically dedicated to fund journalism, but there are certainly other taxes, either state or local taxes, that we've seen that have funded journalistic organizations or projects. And I'm really tracking and monitoring these various solutions. So I would love to hear if others know of more.
Thank you. Another question we have is, how would we get funding to mount a public campaign? I guess something similar to how did New Voices get funding, perhaps, or how were you get the support to do the work you did in New Jersey?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so Free Press as an organization receives most of its funding through supportive foundations, as well as donors. So the organization itself has 1.4 million members around the country, many of which give small donations. For the Civic Info Bill campaign, we've received funding from the Dodge Foundation, which is a place-based funder in New Jersey that supports lots of different journalism projects through its Informed Communities program, as well as the Democracy Fund, which is a national foundation that supports a lot of journalism, especially engaged journalism efforts, including supporting projects like the Jefferson Center, which is a partner in the Your Voice Ohio project there in Ohio. One of the challenges, and to be honest with you about this, is that in order to run campaigns and lobby for legislation, a lot of times it requires what is called C4 funding, which is essentially allowing for you to advocate for specific legislation and interact with lawmakers on that piece of legislation on a regular basis. And so a lot of nonprofit journalism gets what's called C3 funding. So for the Civic Info Bill campaign, Free Press received both C3 and C4 money. So we received C3 money to do a lot of the public education and public engagement work. But in order to do the State House lobby, we had to raise C4 money. And C4 money is a lot harder to raise. And so for folks who are super interested in nonprofit tax law, I'm sure could explain that in a lot better way. But I share that because these campaigns are can be challenging to raise money for. But I think that one of the most important things and places to start, which is what we did in New Jersey, was the public engagement work, was actually beginning to build support for these types of ideas. And I think that no matter where the money comes from, you're not going to be able to actually pass that legislation without actually building a popular constituency for it. And that doesn't require some of the challenges that come with actually running a legislative campaign. So I think a good place to start is to think about how are we actually going to be raising money, or what does it take to actually start to engage the public on these types of issues.
Thank you. And we have a couple more questions that have come in. Let's see. When Madeline suggested public support as a solution, perhaps we should define that as something other than state aid. Are there models like public radio, for example, in place somewhere? And for Common Cause Policy Matters, might there be opportunities to pursue this new definition of, quote, public funding that doesn't require government policy change here? Current politics of Ohio more likely to view media as the enemy of the state, so a state solution might not be viable.
This is Zach talking again. I mean, a couple of at least partial answers to that. One is that we have a very long history of support in Ohio for public broadcasting, and even for the State House News Bureau, which may not, be everything you want, but nevertheless, it's something that people throughout the state hear all the time. So in that sense, I feel that is a long-standing thing that has been passed by legislators of all stripes for many decades, and therefore shouldn't be seen. I'm sure there'll be some who see it as an enemy, but they've been doing it right along, and I've even had a little bit of contact with the people at the Broadcast Educational Media Commission, and while they're not seeking more money right now from the state than they just got in the budget that was just approved in July, I think that there are some real opportunities there. I would also note, and maybe perhaps the folks at Free Press or elsewhere would know more about this, I noticed in looking at the numbers that are available through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that there is some $70 million a year in local government support for public broadcasting. Now, I haven't examined where all of that is and what kind of support that really is, but that is out there, tens of millions across the country. So it would probably be worthwhile to investigate that closely and see who's doing that, where, why have they been successful, have they been able to do it in different kinds of political atmospheres.
Thanks, Zach. Another great question that came in, kind of a question / comment / suggestion. Just as a note, the Ohio Revised Code allows for the creation of regional arts and cultural districts, and those districts have certain taxing authority. I wonder if there might be an advantage to looking at that code that might create community news districts that could also have dedicated funding. All right, Zach's taking notes. That means he's going to be looking into it.
Maybe I can ask another question kind of building on that. I was very intrigued by what Madeline said about public libraries, because Ohio has better support for public libraries than practically any state in the country, and has had for many years the best public libraries, not just in the big cities, but in rural areas throughout the state. We have money that comes off the top from the state budget to public libraries that is, in fact, until quite recently when that was reduced, most public libraries in the state were funded largely through the state income tax, and that's been true for decades. So we have enormous public support for library levies. They pass with regularly 80% of the time. And so I'm wondering, is there in fact a precedent here where other places, libraries have been an agency through which we've been able to see these kinds of community efforts move forward for more journalistic activity? Jeez.
Oh, Matt, is that?
Well, I think one way to think of that question is, again, going back to how Mike emphasized in terms of the Civic Info Bill campaign, in working with the public to create solutions for local journalism, those solutions may not look like traditional journalism as we have known and conceptualized it. And so, a lot of the solutions that we heard from residents at public forums looked again like media literacy, or like civic data, civic hacking, and look like many of the functions that many libraries perform or aspire to perform. And so one initiative that has gained attention in the city of Longmont outside of Boulder in Colorado has really looked at how the library can be expanded to serve the role as not only a traditional library, but as a place to really facilitate the distribution and generation of local news and information.
Thank you, Madeline. Let's see, we have another question. And this is one that I have heard from several people just in talking about this, including my dad, I think. With public funding, how do you address the concern that if reporting ticks off politicians, then funding could be threatened? And Mike, I think you touched on that in your presentation. So
yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and I understand it. And it's something that we heard routinely throughout the Civic Info Bill campaign. And so, so I think what's important when talking about public funding for journalism is that there is a 50+ year history in this country of public funding going to public interest media. This is not something new. This is just really a reimagining of what that funding could be used for. And, you know, NPR and PBS, when you look at polls, are some of the most trusted news sources in the country. And I don't think anyone would argue that Frontline, for instance, pulls its punches when it comes to its reporting. And so to me, it's not so much where the funding comes from, but what protections are actually in place to ensure editorial independence. And so in the case of the Civic Info Bill, that was why we created a 15-member board, which kind of seemed ridiculous because it's really a large board. But the reason why we did that was we wanted to make sure that neither the universities involved or politicians had a majority of the board and could potentially interfere with certain types of grants being made. It has its own independent staff. It is a bipartisan board. There are explicit parts in the legislation that prohibit government or university interference in the reporting. So, you know, for me, it's not so much necessarily, again, where the money comes from, but what actually firewalls and protections are in place, because I think no matter where the money comes from, whether it's commercial media, whether it's nonprofit media, whether it's government funded media, there is always a threat that the people who fund it will interfere with the editorial product. And so it's more about making sure that those protections are in place. And I think that while I understand this, the concern or the skepticism, I do think that, you know, I think what we really need to do is kind of more think about not that journalism will now solely be funded through public money, but instead what's the role of public funding to address those gaps in coverage in communities, and how can that be paired with both commercial media and nonprofit media and all the other ways that journalism is funded? What's actually the role that public funding can play? And I think it can play an important role.
You got me convinced.
Now I just got to convince your dad.
Right. And also, you know, on that note, Yosef made the point about Sinclair, and that's a private corporation that was very heavy-handed in the editorializing, you know, packages that had to be aired. So you, especially with the rise of the corporation being like such a powerful entity in our country and our politics today, I see, you can also see similar questions could be raised about having corporations controlling the news. But we do have another question that came in, and it says, love the emphasis on building community-centered campaigns to support local journalism, including new ways of doing it. But is there no urgency around saving existing papers that are going under? Is that something that's more difficult to build public support for? And I think this has to be our last question, because then Mike has a few things to say to wrap it up, and we're at time. So, urgency around saving existing papers.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think the challenge here is that for the longest time, existing newspapers have relied on one business model to generate revenue, and that's ads. But the ad model has transformed when you have new online platforms like Facebook and Google who have kind of dominated that, and new tech platforms like Netflix or Hulu that are taking some of those advertising dollars away from broadcasters. So there's this idea of, all right, how do you adapt and how do you change to survive in the modern world? And the answer is not consolidation, but it's actually diversifying your business model. So Free Press had mentioned one idea of taxing Facebook and Google to fund journalism because they dominate the ad market. So that's definitely one solution. Other solutions are, how do we change the model that we rely on right now? Do we have to transform ourselves? So a lot of newspapers are now transforming into this nonprofit approach, where they're no longer a corporation, but they're a nonprofit, where they can seek funding from foundations, philanthropists, and others, and kind of change the way their business model operates. So I think that the big challenge is that the model's changing. Newspapers have to adapt and figure out new ways to stay active, and that could be public funding, that could be a tax, that could be just changing how your business model works.
Great. Thank you. And I just want to say, I mean, the questions and the comments are so awesome. It shows what great, smart people we have on this webinar, and what we have the right people in the virtual room and to try to get something started. So Mike, you can close us out here.
I can actually take that.
Yeah, go ahead. I've been talking enough. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, again, I just want to thank our partners at Policy Matters Ohio and Common Cause Ohio for bringing us together, and for all of you who are on the call. We will be sending out an email following the call with a video recording, the resources that all of us various organizations mentioned, and an invitation to sign up to continue the conversation. I think Catherine made a really great point about the long-term nature of a movement, and how conversations like this, simply to bring people together to understand the issue and explore solutions, is really the start to create that movement. And so all of us are committed to continuing the conversation, and I invite you to do that with us.
Thank you. Thanks for joining, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. We'll be in touch soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Get all these chats.